Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Darien Library this Tuesday evening for the Rise of the Virtuoso. We are joined tonight by Dr. Gil Harel. He's a musicologist and music theorist. He's held positions at several colleges and universities and is currently a faculty member at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he wears several hats, including musical director of theater productions. As you heard while you were coming in, he's going to direct Pippin this year. And if you're lucky, hopefully you'll be able to watch. We thank you for your support. Oh, I apologize. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections, available to the community. If you have any questions during the program, please put them in the Q&A section and Gil will answer them at the end of his presentation. I'm now going to pass the mic over. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. It's so great to be here with you folks once again this evening and to be talking about a particular topic which I think remains a point of fascination for audience members across time, across eras, across styles. Of course, we're talking about the virtuoso. Specifically, we're talking about the rise of the virtuoso, as you noticed in the title. So the trajectory of this lecture will take us from a general overview of the concept of the virtuoso, what that word suggests, how that particular phenomenon manifests in the realm of music. And then we're going to talk about some historical virtuosi who are really important in terms of illustrating the ethos and the zeitgeist of a period where the exaltation of the virtuoso took place. In other words, we're going to talk not only about how we think these virtuosi have attained and been able to reach these unprecedented heights as performers, but we're also looking at how they've been received historically by audiences throughout generations. And so we're going to look at the 19th century today, but we're going to end by looking at the 20th and 21st century by looking at some modern virtuosi, including Yucha Wong, and we'll talk perhaps briefly about Daniil Trifonov, someone else who has made a lot of waves and has been a popular recording artist with Deutsche Grammophon specifically. In fact, he just released an album, some of the most difficult repertoire in the canon, works by Prokofiev and Scriabin and Shostakovich and other, you notice these are all Russian composers. So there's a tie-in there, and we will allude to it throughout the program. Now, as Amanda mentioned, anyone who's got a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and I would be delighted to take your questions during the duration of this program. So first, we should, I think, begin by talking about this term, and we should define it. What is a virtuoso exactly? I think we might define a virtuoso as a performer who exhibits a kind of preternatural skill which cannot simply be gained through extensive practice. Some of you may be familiar with this idea. It's been referred to as the 10,000 hour rule, that if you practice anything for 10,000 hours, whether it's a foreign language or a musical instrument, you'll become extremely proficient on it. And that's true. You can be an extremely proficient violinist, guitarist, pianist, whatever it is, and not be a virtuoso. A virtuoso is someone who goes beyond that. And there are all sorts of studies. There have been attempts, especially in the last 30 years, to understand the brain function of a virtuoso. And I'll talk about that a little bit. We'll hint at it here and there through the program, but I should, of course, add as a footnote that, all of this attempt to link the study of encephalography and biomechanics of musical performance, this is hotly contested in the world of scholarship and in the academic world. And I don't think there's any official consensus on exactly how a virtuoso's brain works. There have been attempts historically to understand brilliant minds. For example, J.S. Bach was buried in 1750 in a little lich yard in Leipzig in Germany. And 100 years later, more or less, he was dug up. His corpse was exhumed because people wanted to study his brain and see if his skull was larger and how could he have achieved and accomplished what he did. And they found that, of course, the measurements were completely normal. And I think there have been similar studies with people like Einstein. The idea that somehow if you're a brilliant performer, or that you're a brilliant human being for that matter, that you must have different anatomy, different biology, has been debunked, or at least has been hotly debated throughout the years. So we're going to really focus on defining the virtuoso, and then we'll get into some of the virtuosi of the 19th century, specifically Niccolò Paganini on the violin and Franz Liszt on the piano. And we'll look at some examples of their works and talk about how they really exemplify this emerging tradition of the virtuoso. So we've defined that word as referring to a musician who exhibits a kind of supernatural skill on their instrument, able to do things which a normal player simply could not, even with extensive regular practice. That is to say, I could practice the piano hours and hours a day for decades, and I wouldn't be able to do what Yucha Wong can do, or what Daniil Trifonov, or what Murray Pariah, or name any piano virtuoso you like, whether it's Evgeny Kissin or older figures like Marta Argerich, Glenn Gould. These virtuosi are able to achieve feats which are simply off the table for most performers, even exceptional ones, and even professionals. So that's how we might define a virtuoso. What we would discover if we were to dig a little bit beneath the surface is that these virtuosi tend to have a few recurring attributes in common. Number one, they tend to come from musical families. Now, that's not always the case, and there are exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, these musicians tend to exhibit skill at a very young age because they are immersed, steeped in music from their earliest formative years. And that was certainly the case with Paganini. It was the case with Liszt. It was even the case with Beethoven. I mean, his father wasn't a great musician. His name was Johann van Beethoven, and he was a second-rate singer who was a kind of a washed-up tenor who couldn't hit the high notes by the time he hit his late 30s. Nonetheless, music was a part of his life. That is to say, Ludwig van Beethoven, who we just refer to as Beethoven. Nobody thinks of Johann van Beethoven or Caspar van Beethoven. I mean, these people lived, of course, but their names are not enshrined in the canon. So immersion at a very young age seems to be a recurring theme, and there is no substitute for it. You've heard this repeated about learning languages and absorbing all sorts of things that children absorb at a time when certain synapses are firing in the brain, which are turned off later in life. What that means is essentially that if you are surrounded by music as a young child, you'll have a better chance at being a great musician. It doesn't mean that you'll be a good musician or even a musician at all. It just means that if you are destined to get to that top tier of elite virtuosi, the likelihood is that your parents, or at least one parent, will have been a musician, and therefore you would have been exposed to music at a very young age. And there have been studies about this that show that that's also true in terms of the phenomenon of perfect pitch. Many of these virtuosi do have perfect pitch, which is, of course, the ability to recognize or produce a tone without any reference, to hear a pitch and to immediately say it's an F sharp or a B flat or whatever it is. Or to hear a chord and to say that's a B flat minor 7 chord, that's a D dominant 7 chord. Normal people can't do that. And when I say normal, I mean the vast majority of people, because perfect pitch presents in approximately 1 out of 10,000 Westerners. So this is a rare gift to have perfect pitch, and it is often intertwined with being a great performer. For example, Beethoven had perfect pitch, Mozart had perfect pitch. Scholars are almost certain that Bach had perfect pitch. And this sort of thing wasn't documented in the 17th and early 18th centuries, so we don't know for sure, but the evidence suggests that he did. Miles Davis had perfect pitch. A number of contemporary musicians that you might be familiar with, Keith Jarrett, for example, has perfect pitch. So this gift is something that's often intertwined with being a virtuoso, but there are many virtuosi who don't have perfect pitch, so it's not always the case. Another thing that we find is that these musicians often receive instruction from elite tier institutions or highly revered and esteemed pedagogues. A great example of this would be musicians who graduate from the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. Oh, if we were to name 2 examples, well, let's go on the violin, Hilary Hahn, and on the piano, Yucha Wong. Two performers, Hilary Hahn's a little bit older, she'd be closer to 40, and Yucha Wong closer to 30. But these are two musicians who have achieved remarkable feats in their careers, and they're still quite young. And both graduated from the Curtis Institute, which is an elite doesn't quite cover it. It's the elite of the elite institutions. And they have approximately 140 students who are admitted each year. In other words, just enough students to fill an orchestra and an opera company. And you can imagine how competitive an institution would be if you're taking in 140 students total per year. So again, parents or a home life that immerses one in music, incredibly sensitive ears, often intertwined, but not always intertwined with absolute or perfect pitch, and instruction on a very elite level, either from famous pedagogues who are sort of freelancers, or nowadays from an elite institution such as the Curtis Institute or Juilliard or Mannes, which of course employs famous pedagogues. So that's some of what we can expect to encounter today. Now, you might ask, well, Gil, weren't there virtuosi in the Renaissance and in the medieval period, and certainly in the Baroque period? And the answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, we know some of their names. However, it should be pointed out and emphasized that the rise of the virtuoso, the exaltation of the virtuoso, is something that dates specifically to the 19th century, to what we call the Romantic period. There are a few reasons for that. Number one, what we might think of as the cult of the individual, which really develops and waxes in the 19th century. The idea that individual performers become more important than ever. That really is a phenomenon that's tied to Beethoven, not so much as a performer, though Beethoven was indeed a virtuoso keyboardist, at least until his hearing loss was so pronounced that he could no longer play at that elite level. But the idea that Beethoven sort of wrote music that appealed to him as an artist, that was coalescing in his mind and had to be brought forth. This idea that an individual's will was incredibly powerful and had to be heeded is associated with Beethoven and would be picked up not only by musicians, but also by philosophers of the century. Think of Nietzsche's Die Wille zur Macht, the will to power, or another one would be Schopenhauer, Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, the world as will and representations. This idea of a powerful will, an individual who, like Nietzsche's Übermensch, is going to transcend the boundaries of what a normal person is capable of. This is an important phenomenon that we see in the literature of the 19th century, and it's intertwined with the reception, and as I've used this word a few times now, the exaltation of the virtuoso. So we're going to look at two famous examples from the 19th century. First, a violinist by the name of Niccolò Paganini. Paganini is an interesting figure for a number of reasons. I think in his own time, he was known as someone who was so gifted that people couldn't understand how he was able to play what he could play. In fact, there were rumors circulated in Italy, but also elsewhere on the continent, in Europe, that suggested that the only way he could have attained such skill was to sell his soul to make a kind of a Faustian deal with Beelzebub or Satan or whoever it is, the devil. That's the only way he could be so talented. People could not rationalize his abilities because they transcended what a violinist was capable of. And there were many capable violinists, professional violinists, virtuosi violinists in the Baroque period. Some of you may be familiar with the name Arcangelo Corelli, Antonio Vivaldi, Heinrich Ignaz Franz von Bieber. They were all terrific violinists from everything that historians have been able to cobble together. However, Paganini's music goes beyond what their music did. And I want to talk about this for a minute because we're going to transition out to the discussion of idiomatic, non-idiomatic, and extended technique writing for particular instruments. Now, a violin has 4 strings, and we think of it primarily as a melodic instrument. Think of orchestras, right? Think of your favorite symphony. The odds are that the violins have the melody for at least a substantial portion of that symphony. There may be moments where the clarinet gets the tune, or perhaps it's even in the bassoon, and maybe there's moments where the brass will take over. But the violin is sort of the workhorse of the orchestra, and we think of it primarily as a melodic instrument. What we're going to see in some of this virtuoso music by Paganini is the pushing of the envelope in terms of what a violinist is expected to be at least capable of. Now, this includes a couple of things. Number one, playing on multiple strings simultaneously, sometimes in what we call a homophonic texture, meaning that the strings you're playing the same rhythms, but just different notes, sometimes even in a polyphonic texture. Other things you might be asked to do in a Paganini etude or caprice would be to play notes that are well out of the range of what a normal violinist might think of as the conventional range of the instrument. Now, when I say range, I should be clear that I mean high notes. You can't go lower than the lowest string on the violin. You can't go lower than the G3. That's the lowest string. There's no technique that's going to bring you lower than that note unless you detune the peg. However, the higher notes are a bit of a different story. You see, a violinist can employ a very specific technique, depressing the strings with very specific pressure in very specific places to reach into what's sometimes known as the harmonic range. And this can produce tones that you'll see them notated in the sheet music. I've got a couple of examples I'm going to share with you, where you have to use so many ledger lines that even a seasoned musician might have to take a moment to figure out exactly what notes are being written down in the score. So these exceptionally high notes, not only are they hard to read, but more importantly, for the performer, they're very hard to play in tune. Think about that for a minute. It's not just a case of putting your finger in the correct position and bowing across the string as you normally would in the conventional range of the instrument. Now you've got to employ this extended technique to get notes which, strictly speaking, are outside of that conventional range. And when a musician can do it well and can really bring those notes out with good volume and with good intonation, it can be a very exciting thing to listen to. And we'll see that in, I think it's in the fifth Paganini Caprice we'll listen to in A minor. It's really, really remarkable. You look at the score and you think, there's no way. Other things we might expect here would be double and triple and even quadruple stops. So the playing of chords that means that the performer will have to roll the bow across the strings. We're also going to see music that's played at an incredibly fast tempi, or maybe at a slower tempo with incredibly fast notes. There's a lot to say about Paganini's music in terms of this extended technique phenomenon. I think the best thing to do would be to just look at the score, in which case I can point out exactly what it is we're looking at. And even if you don't read score, some of you are veterans of these programs now, and you're familiar with how illuminating these scores can be. So here's the first Caprice. Now, the title Caprice is telling, is it not? Because what it suggests is something that's of a fantastical nature, of a whimsical nature, something that's not bound by the strict conventions of form in the classical period. And I should point out that Paganini was born in 1782. So he's born at the time when Mozart has just moved to Vienna, where Haydn is still working for the Prince of Esterhazy. This is a time where music has really reached the apogee of the classical period. And here we're entering the Romantic period, and you can see elements of classicism in Paganini's writing, but also a really strong classical foundation. So what we're looking at here, if you notice, these notes have 3 bars on them. And that means they are 30-second notes. So even though the tempo is not fast, the notes go by in a sort of hurricane. Notice the rapid change of registers, how the notes cover ups and downs that are extremely disparate. It starts in E major and it's going to go to E minor. So we've got this dichotomy and opposition between the modality of major and minor. It's very short, 1:46. Let's go ahead and listen to Paganini's Caprice in E major. You can see this passage here where the violinist is asked to play this sequence of descending notes, and they've got to play those notes in parallel with a lower voice that's played on a different string. Imagine trying to bring that off as a violinist. It would be a very difficult thing to do, especially at this tempo. Now, this is fascinating. If you really look at this last page, there's some interesting things, especially in this last chord. You can see there are 4 notes. Now, some of you might say, well, but why does he write this top note twice? Well, you see the 0 open it. What he wants is the open string of the E string, the top string of the violin. He wants it to be played. He also wants you to play simultaneously to double that note on the lower string. In other words, it's completely unnecessary. It doesn't need to be there, but Paganini puts it anyway because he wants you to play on all 4 strings at the same time for that final chord. Now, some of you may have listened to that and thought, well, it certainly was impressive. And looking at the score brings me a little bit closer to understanding just how complex this music is when rendered in the conventional notation. But maybe some of you were thinking, perhaps, it's my spitballing here, the music is impressive, but it wasn't especially compelling. I wouldn't find myself humming this tune or whistling it as I walk down the street. I wouldn't find myself singing it in the shower. So therefore, is this good music? We know it's hard music, but is it good music? And this is a question that comes up occasionally in this discussion of virtuoso repertoire, especially with respect to the music of Paganini and Liszt, who we'll get to momentarily. The music is certainly breathtaking to listen to in a way, and certainly watching it performed live would be especially impressive. But at the same time, if it lacks melody or if it lacks harmonic ingenuity, is it something that people would enjoy listening to? And I think the jury is out on that one. I see Peter says, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Well, I think people have that reaction quite a bit when they listen to music which is written for the sole purpose of showcasing the virtuoso talents of the performer. This is something that comes up in the discussion and the opposition between composers who were born, 2 composers who were born almost exactly at the same time. Franz Liszt, born in 1811, and just a year before that, born just outside of Warsaw, Frédéric Chopin, born in 1810. When we talk about Liszt, I'll talk about Chopin, and I'll tell you how not everyone, but many historians and commentators and pundits have reflected on this disparity between the 2. I've got one more piece by Paganini for you. This is the A minor Caprice. And when you listen to it, we're going to look at the score and we'll talk about how unusual and esoteric this score is. Well, what are we looking at exactly here? There's no bar line, there's no measure, because there's no point in having a measure. This is just a series of arpeggios and descending scales, arpeggios and descending scales. Now, do you remember what I said earlier about those ledger lines, the lines that go above the staff? Well, if I asked even a really seasoned veteran sheet music reader what note this is, they'd probably really have to think about it and maybe even count, because it's so many ledger lines above. It's almost 2 full staves above where you would normally be playing. Some might even describe it as obnoxious. It's outrageous to have notes written all the way in this tessitura. But of course, that's exactly what Paganini is going for. He wants the performer. And remember, when we say performer, in this case, it's really referring to himself. Composers in this period were only just starting to imagine that posterity would embrace their works. Beethoven, for example, seems to have been aware of the fact that history would reflect on his legacy long after he was gone. But Mozart had no such delusions, and Haydn probably would never have even imagined such a thing. For Bach, it would have been completely incomprehensible. So the zeitgeist is changing completely. The spirit of the time is experiencing a paradigm shift away from the kind of quasi-medieval anonymity of the previous periods and into a new era where composers are now exalted and regarded as demigods, and performers are celebrated in similar fashion. Here is the 5th Caprice by Niccolò Paganini. This is pretty outrageous, is it not? Now, this A that we keep coming back to is the lowest note A that you can play on the violin. So you can't go lower than this, but it goes higher and higher. It starts all the way here on an A in the 6th octave and eventually winds up in the 7th octave. Now, some of you may have been thinking, if it's any higher than that, I won't be able to hear it. Only my dog will be able to distinguish that there's a note there, but a human wouldn't be able to. And you're not wrong. Once you go above the 7th octave, it becomes very difficult for humans to distinguish pitch. So we would hear a sound, but it would be very hard to hear it and say, oh, it's an A or it's an F sharp or it's a C or whatever. So this is really reaching into the limit, not only of what a performer is capable of playing, but also what a human is capable of distinguishing. You might ask, how many more ledger lines can I go up? And can I play higher notes on special instruments made? For example, a piccolo violin with even shorter strings, could it play higher? The answer is ostensibly yes, but it wouldn't be a satisfying experience for the listener. Let's continue. There's the Paganini 5th Caprice, and there are 24 in the set. Some of them are, I think, more interesting than others. That one, for me, is far more interesting than the first one. We have a name for this type of movement. We call this, for those of you who are fans of Latin, you'll appreciate this. It's called a perpetuum mobile. Perpetuum mobile. All right. I see a question in chat. Beethoven's father badgered him to play piano up to 12 hours a day. That's true. Sometimes waking him up at practice, to midnight to practice. He was abused. He was apparently a very bad pianist, attacking the piano with a banging force. Well, he wasn't a bad pianist by any stretch. He actually was a superb pianist. And when he came to Vienna in the 1790s, he was known primarily as a pianist. This is before his reputation as a composer was established. But I agree with you that his music was pure genius, absolutely. All right, let me tell you a little bit about how Paganini's life ended. I think you'll find this part fascinating. Remember when we said that Paganini had kind of created a bit of a controversy because his recitals, the way he comported himself and the way he played, people could not rationalize such skill on full display in front of their eyes. They thought that he must have made a deal with the devil in order to play as he did. Well, Paganini, because he lived this unusual life, and his childhood was an unusual one. Obviously, his skill manifested at a young age. They tried to find him a teacher. They found him a teacher. The teacher heard him play and said, "I can't teach him. He's got to go find another teacher. I'm going to send him to my teacher." Then that teacher heard him and sent him to his teacher. By the time he was 10 years old, there was nobody who would have taught him at that point. He kind of was on his own as a violinist. His success led to difficulties in his life. And in fact, he became what we would probably now today call a degenerate gambler. He became somebody who was obsessed with gambling and with cards and dice and the like. Later on in his life, he would attempt to open a casino in Paris. It was a disaster. He lost all his money. He had to start pawning his instruments. And when he he was no stranger to illness, but when he became very ill towards the end of his life, he had to resort to selling those instruments to some of those famous Guarneri and Stradivarius instruments to paying his medical bills. The story goes that when he was very sick, the local diocese sent over a Catholic priest to offer him the last rites in the expectation that he would die. But Paganini was kind of a haughty guy, and he said, "Hey, guys, I'm not going to die. I'll be just fine." And a week later, what happened to him? Well, he died. Now, what happens if you die without receiving the sacrament of the last rites? Well, in a conservative Catholic Italy, which is what you had at the time, and in France, also conservative Catholic country, where Paganini spent a lot of time, he was not allowed to be buried in his native city of Genoa. So his body was basically moved around for a period of 4 years before it was finally buried in Parma, approximately 200 kilometers away from his home city. And he had to get a special papal dispensation to be buried in a Catholic cemetery. So a fascinating postlude, I guess we'd say, to Paganini's life. All right, we're now going to talk about Franz Liszt. It's interesting. Okay, I see Jane says Robert Greenberg. I respect Robert Greenberg, but I would disagree that Beethoven was a bad pianist. Remember that Beethoven, we know that he was able to play his Hammerklavier sonata, so he must have been exceptional to be able to play the fugue in the fourth movement. And we know also that he entertained and was the sort of in-house pianist for Prince Lichnowsky and Count Lobkowitz. He would entertain the aristocracy of Vienna. So interesting. All right. He had an unusual technique, that much is true, and he was known for playing with a more forceful and percussive technique. All right. Let's go on to Franz Liszt. Liszt, Hungarian composer and pianist, also skills manifested at a very young age. Supposedly, Liszt met Beethoven when he was about 12 years old, and Beethoven heard him play. There's only one problem with that. Well, if Beethoven really did hear him play, how could Beethoven have had any constructive commentary, given that at this point in the 1820s, Beethoven was completely deaf? Well, nonetheless, Liszt is going to make a very big name for himself, primarily as a performer, but later in his career as a composer. Let's talk a little bit about Liszt's career trajectory. Liszt is associated with pioneering and establishing one of the most hallowed traditions in conservatories and music schools today, and that, of course, is the tradition of the recital. And if you think about it, back in Mozart's day, or certainly back in the Baroque period, this idea of a recital did not exist. And by a recital, we're specifically referring to a program wherein a performer presents music by different composers from different periods. Mozart had plenty of performances, but he wouldn't have played anyone's music if it wasn't his own. There would have been no reason to do that. Why would you promote another composer's works when you were the one who was you'd be primarily focused on trying to showcase your own skills as a composer and as a performer? So the recital is a new phenomenon, and it develops primarily thanks to Liszt. And Liszt is going to take his show on the road. So he's going to become one of the first musicians who makes a career as a traveling virtuoso who goes from town to town, playing concerts, and it must be said, attracting the profound adoration of fans all over Europe, and especially in Germany and in France and in Italy. And Liszt is going to be so successful at this that he's going to stir up a kind of frenzy and a hysteria. And what do we call this? Well, some of you no doubt know what it's called, and if you don't, you can guess. It's called Lista Mania. There are caricatures from the 19th century where they show Liszt being chased by a sort of a gang of women, young girls who are chasing him, and they're all holding scissors. You might be wondering, why are they holding scissors? And the answer, of course, is because in the age before selfies, how would you prove that you had seen a great performer? And the answer is you'd snip a locket of their hair. Seems like a very bizarre violation of privacy and a kind of a very dangerous thing, maybe someone chasing you with scissors. But in the 19th century, this was not uncommon. So Franz Liszt is going to pioneer the phenomenon of the recital. He's going to spearhead a new configuration of the stage, whereby the piano is turned 90 degrees to the audience and the performer sits seated perpendicular to the audience so that their profile is visible. In the Baroque period, it would have been more common for the keyboardist to play with his or her back to the audience, perhaps in some configurations facing the audience, but the 90-degree pivot is associated very strongly with Franz Liszt. Early in his career, he's going to write music which I think is sort of in the vein of what we looked at with Paganini. Namely, it's music that is difficult for difficulty's sake. It's virtuoso, just because it serves as a vehicle for the performer to exhibit and manifest and showcase their own skills. And many people would say that, well, it's not the most interesting music. It's interesting to watch it, I suppose, and it's impressive, but it's not the most compelling sound that they've ever heard. I think that Liszt's music sometimes checks that box, unfortunately, and there have been some scholars who have said that essentially, Liszt wrote music for the pianist, whereas composers like Brahms and Chopin wrote music for the piano. That is to say that Brahms and Chopin's music is considered more poetic, and in some ways, I think on a more technical level, more harmonically interesting. There are, however, some pieces by Liszt which really work, and I think really are very successful in terms of creating a work that's not only difficult and virtuosic, but also highly compelling and enchanting for the listener. One such work would be an etude written for the piano. Liszt wrote almost exclusively for the piano, and it's called La Campanella. Actually, this is based on a tune by Paganini. Liszt just transposed it and put it on the piano, and he dressed it up in a tremendous amount of embellishment and ornamentation that makes it very difficult. So let's take a look at the score here, and we'll listen to La Campanella by Liszt. The piece is based on a repeating motif, and there is a repeating note that comes back throughout, and it's in this case a D sharp. You can see that the pinky and the thumb here on that D sharp, and it's going to come over here. This score presentation style, some of you are familiar with. It really looks like a video game in some ways, but it's very helpful because we see the pianist's hands and the keyboard. We also see the notes lighting up in real time as they're struck, which just allows folks who are perhaps more drawn to a visual presentation for understanding exactly what's happening in a very intricate score. This is a very effective tool for conveying that information. So it looks kind of like Piano Hero, if I can paraphrase the video game Guitar Hero. This kind of looks like Piano Hero, but it's actually a very useful way to appreciate difficult works especially. Some of the things that you'll see in this piece which make it exceptionally difficult involve the rapid octave shifts. Now you'll see that very clearly in the hands and in this visual presentation with the lights, that the hands have to jump register very frequently. I would say the hardest part here in the whole piece is two things. One, that the right hand has to play increasingly difficult and more difficult embellished versions of the melody. So when the melody is presented at first, have a listen to how simple it is in its initial presentation and how complex it gets after each subsequent presentation. At one point, the melody is presented with the left hand leaping from one octave to the next while the right hand is playing an inner voice. And the hardest part is that you have to play a trill, that is to say, a rapid alternation of tones between your outer fingers on your right hand, namely the ring finger and the pinky, or depending on the pianist, some people might do the pinky and the middle finger, or the ring finger and the middle finger. It's exceptionally, exceptionally difficult to waggle essentially your ring finger and your middle finger and to try to bring out that trill, or certainly to try to bring out a trill between your pinky and your ring finger. You know, those are very dependent fingers in piano theory, and it's not easy to do. But Liszt puts it in there deliberately because, well, simply put, he could do it. Let's listen to La Campanella. All right, so we're now on to the second presentation of the tune, and notice how much more complex it is. You can see these three lines here, which represent D sharp in 3 octaves, 5th octave, 6th octave, 7th octave. And now we have the melody presented in the, or played essentially in the left hand, while the pinky and the ring finger have to grab bass notes. So have a listen, I'll back it up just a little bit. So now we're into the next variation, and notice that you've got to play all these repeated tones. What that means in the piano is that you've got to actually strike the same key with rotating fingers between your first, third, and first, second, and third fingers. So your thumb to your middle finger. Have a listen to that. So here's that infamous moment, which is just one of the ultimate bugbears in the piano repertoire, something that even seasoned pianists who are professional performers and experienced sight readers dread having to play something like this. You can see the trill there in the outer voice where the melody comes back in, now played in the left hand, but really in the treble clef of the piano, whereas the right thumb has to constantly hit that D sharp. La Campanella, by the way, means the little bell. And here that D sharp, we can imagine, is the bell being repeatedly struck. So here's that infamous trill coming out of the two-handed trill, and that same trill is maintained now in the weakest fingers of the right hand. All right, so we're into our coda. The coda in Italian means tail. It is the last part of the piece. And you can see here what Paganini is doing. He's asking you to play the melody now in repeated notes and in octaves while the left hand loops around madly. It's a real bonanza. It's very difficult to play. Not the hardest part of the piece, but up there. There you have Liszt's La Campanella. Yeah, the pianist here is a YouTube figure who goes by the mononym Rousseau. And he's one of the most popular classical-oriented pianists on YouTube, although he plays everything. He plays, Disney hits, and he writes sort of virtuoso arrangements of popular tunes. But again, he just goes by the mononym Rousseau. And some of his videos have millions of hits. This particular video we just watched has 25,655,000 hits, which, for a tune by a composer who most people have never heard of. And I know people in this call obviously are familiar with Liszt, but my sense is that the lay listener, the average person would not know who Franz Liszt is. So for a video to have 25 million plus hits suggests that it's not just about a great performance, but it's also about a compelling and magnetic presentation, which we see on full display here with that media and software that presents the notes as these flaring lights. Let's see, Cindy asks, how does he do that? Yeah, this is a question that we would constantly asking when it comes to virtuoso performers, how they're able to do what they do. We said that in the case of Paganini, it was suspected that he was in league with the devil. In fact, there was a film, I want to say 9 years ago, called The Devil's Violinist, and it was about Paganini. And, one thing that we should stress is that these virtuosi, they practice relentlessly. It's sometimes assumed that because they're a virtuoso, they don't need to practice, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, Liszt was famous for practicing for hours and hours, up to 10 hours a day, which is it's an incredibly tall task to find oneself seated on a piano bench for that long. But nonetheless, it's a testament to the discipline of someone who already has a tremendous amount of innate skill. An understanding from my piano teacher. Yeah, that's right. Edith asks about Liszt's unusual hand span. It's true. It's true. Paganini also had unusually, and some would say abnormally, large hands. Rachmaninoff is another one who had abnormally large hands. Supposedly, Rachmaninoff could reach from a C in the fourth octave to a G in the fifth octave, or a span of what we call a 12th. Obviously, most people can't even get anywhere near that. In some cases, there have been suggestions about medical conditions these composers may have had. Marfan syndrome, for one. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or Danlos-Ehlers syndrome is another one that's been suggested, I think, for with respect specifically to Paganini. Good. Yes, Peter says a great illustration of the performance. Yeah, I agree. Susan asks a very technical question about the piano. Is the action of the piano loosened? The action refers to what you might think of as the springiness, the responsiveness of the keys. And this is relevant, actually, because when we play certain types of repertoire, you might want lighter or heavier actions. But Susan, it's a great question. It's impossible for me to know the answer. But in general, you would want something that has a very, very springy light action, so that when you're playing some of those triplet figures, for example, you want that triplet to come off cleanly. So, you need the key to spring back up. That's a great question. All right, who is playing? We said Rousseau. You should check out Rousseau. That he goes by a mononym, like Madonna, but it's just Rousseau. So he's someone who plays all sorts of music, including a lot of staples from the canon of Western art music, but also, as I said earlier, he does virtuoso arrangements of songs from Frozen, things like that. He'll do piano arrangements of Vivaldi concerti, things that are unusual. And clearly, he's trying to showcase something special. All right, one more performer to get to today, and we're going to spring ahead over a century, and we're going to talk about Yucha Wong. Now, some of you may be familiar with Miss Wong. She is as famous for her performances and for her skill as a pianist as she is perhaps for her outfits. A simple Google search of Yuja Wong will give you a lot of information about how she comports herself and dresses at concerts. The New Yorker did a terrific write-up about her, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, but it was written by an older female journalist, and it could never have been written by a male journalist because she's described in the article in the New Yorker as looking like a dominatrix who's come straight out of hell to tame Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata or something like that. And so to describe her as a dominatrix, well, again, that's very polarizing language, I think, and some would say not entirely fair. But the journalist in this case, someone who I think she was in her early 80s when it was written, and she spent a lot of time with Yuja, and Yuja must have approved much of what was written about her, all of what was written about her, to some degree at least. Nonetheless, what we find in Yuja Wong is a really fascinating figure who's very hard to categorize or put into a box that is sort of neatly contained. Let me give you some examples. Number one, well, as the name suggests, she's a Chinese pianist. She was born in China. Her father was a percussionist. She barely has seen her parents since she moved to the States, which she did when she was a teenager to attend the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. When Gary Groff, who was the head of the Curtis Institute at the time when she was there, said that he had never met a student like her, never seen any student play like her, and knew immediately that she was destined to become an international star, and she's fulfilled that destiny and more. She has a specific relationship with the LA Philharmonic and Gustavo Dudamel, where she's an artist in residence there, and she's premiered a number of important, I think, new works. And actually, we're going to listen to one. I've chosen for our last piece today a work by John Adams, not the president, the composer, who's still alive. John Adams would be about 75 now. And it's a piano concerto of sorts. And what you'll find is something interesting about this performance we're going to watch is that she's using an iPad. She's reading off a tablet. And I'll explain why she has to read off a tablet. It's not possible, I don't think, at least not at a world premiere. It'd be unusual to be able to play a newer work like this from memory. We'll say exactly why that is. So she's born and raised in China. She comes from a musical family. Her father's a professional musician. She comes over to the States when she's a teenager, attends one of the premier music institutions filled with some of the greatest recognized, esteemed, and revered, venerated pedagogues in the game. She graduates, and within a couple of years, she gets a gig with I think it was with the BSO actually, and she was filling in, I want to say it was Marta Argerich or somebody had to pull out of a concerto. So she was hired, and they came in and say, well, can you play a Rachmaninoff concerto? And with very little preparation time, she came in and gave what was regarded then, this would have been around 2007, 2008, as a stellar performance that really kind of launched her career. So I should point out that for pianists and violinists, it's important that what we find, and I would say it's important because it's a recurring theme, is that we find that these musicians often make a name for themselves at a very young age. And the way they do that is by attending festivals like Aspen or Tanglewood and playing with under the direction of these famous pedagogues we've alluded to a couple of times now. When she gets to the concert pianist level, where she's now playing with in the big stages in the Carnegie Hall and Walt Disney Hall and David Geffen Hall and some of these massively important venues, she's going to make a name for herself for her presentation and her looks and the way she dresses, often with very short dresses, often with very high heels, often with very bright colors, short hair. And she's kind of addressed this very candidly. She's been asked, why don't you, dress in a more conservative manner with, maybe something that's a little less form-fitting and something that's a little bit more modest. And she said essentially that the music that she plays, she thinks of it as being very beautiful. So why should she dress in a drab fashion she should dress in an attractive fashion that mirrors the beauty of the music she's playing. She's also said, and I think this is a very funny answer to the critics and a very effective one, when she's asked, why do you dress like that? She said, well, I'm, at that time, let's say 27, and I dress like a 27-year-old. And when I'm 47, I'll dress like a 47-year-old. I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on her looks because I think it's sort of beside the point. But it happens to be something that comes up in almost every discussion of Yucha Wong. It seems people want to talk about her sense of fashion and this sartorial presentation that is maybe a little bit more atypical for a concert performer. Personally, I applaud her for it. I think it's important for us to take measures, us, that is to say, people who are involved in the presentation of music from the Western art tradition, to present it in a way that makes it exciting and brings out the vibrant, thrilling nature of that the music innately contains. And if Yuja feels that her style of dress is effective in doing that, I think it's more power to her. All right, before we listen to this John Adams piece, we'll get to a couple of questions. Someone says, if Rock Band had a piano, that display would have been it. Piano Hero is a good way to put it, very fun and interesting one. Yeah, I agree. Exceptionally challenging piece. Great point. Bessie asks a great question here. Is Rousseau a virtuoso because he can play a virtuoso piece? Why isn't he a concert pianist? Terrific question. The answer is, I don't know. I don't know enough about this person personally, and I have never seen them play live, so I can't answer it. But I will say this, just because you can play a virtuoso piece does not mean you're a virtuoso. We don't know how much time a person puts in. You could spend 6 months learning a Chopin etude, Opus 10 number 4, for example, which is a notoriously difficult etude in C sharp minor. If I spent 6 months and I practiced it 2 hours a day, I could play it, I think. Famous last words, right? But I'm not a virtuoso, and I don't pretend to be a virtuoso. I'm a musicologist who plays piano, and I can read halfway decently. I'm a pretty good reader. I can transpose. Sometimes I can transpose on sight. So I have very specific skills in my tool belt, but I'm not a virtuoso by any stretch. I can do things that maybe other pianists would have trouble with. I can improvise. I can play jazz and musical theater and styles that some people, if you've never played those styles, that may be difficult and unfamiliar. But just because you can play a virtuoso piece does not mean you're a virtuoso. However, I've seen enough Rousseau videos, Bessie, to suggest that, yeah, Rousseau's probably up in that tier, up in that breathing that rarefied air. However, there's a huge chasm between that level and what we're going to see in this video with Yucha Wong performing with the LA Philharmonic and Gustavo Dudamel. Here's a work by John Adams. It's called Why Does the Devil Get All the Great Tunes? And it's actually written in the style of a piano concerto, so with orchestra and solo pianist. And you'll see Miss Wong here. I'll go ahead and let's share screens so we're looking at the same thing. And here's some of that unconventional presentation we talked about here. You'll notice she's got on very long stilettos, which it seems to me that would make it harder to play because, pianists have to operate pedals. And in operating the pedal, of course, one needs to have maximum dexterity and control of their feet. So in Yuja's case, she's also reading off a tablet, which often means that you're using your left foot to turn pages, although I'm not sure. It's hard to tell in this video. I've kind of scrutinized it in preparing my notes for this program, and I can't tell if she's using a pedal. It's just as likely that somebody is off stage turning pages from 50 feet away using a Bluetooth device. So welcome to the future. You can see the tempo here is kind of unusual. The tempo indication, which 200 years ago would have been allegro or andante or allegretto, is now gritty, funky, but in strict tempo, twitchy, and bot-like. Okay, that's certainly a lot of information there. The orchestra here is a fairly large one, and notice the style of how the piano part is written. I'll play it, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it after we listen. All right, we'll pause it there. it's an incredibly difficult piece to play. Now, it may not be immediately apparent what's so difficult about this piece. First of all, let's address the elephant in the room because it's modern music. So this is an example of atonality, right? This movement is not in any specific key. So the music here is written in the 20th century style that was pioneered in the early 20th century style. But John Adams was writing music in the when he was in college in 1950s and 60s. He would have been in college in the 60s, I believe. He was writing 12-tone music. He was born in the 40s. So it's atonal. And the reason, if you think about it, why she is reading off the iPad is because how could you possibly keep track of all the time changes? This is something that we didn't really talk about tonight because it's, rhythm, and rhythm is more abstract and esoteric than melody and harmony. But this piece is exceptionally difficult to play because it's just hard to count. And if you were tapping your foot or trying to tap your foot or try to feel a pulse or a recurring pattern, good luck. There are parts that are, pretty consistent, but for the most part, it's changing. It's just so variable that without a score, how could you possibly keep track of that over a period of 10 or 12 minutes? This movement is closer to 12 minutes. So for those of you who like this, you can go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back because you just enjoyed an atonal modern piece. And for many of us, I know that are sworn enemies of the atonal modernist style. I think you should, to ask yourself if you like this, because if you did, then perhaps there's other treasures to be mined, gems to be mined out there in this style. I think John Adams, many people are probably familiar with his operas, right? Nixon in China, Dr. Atomic, Death of Klinghoffer. But this piece, which was written just a few years ago, is a really excellent addition to the repertoire. And it's important to, I think, look at newer pieces that are being written by contemporary composers. Maybe they're written in a style which alienate us, or we're thinking, oh, I don't like atonality. But then you listen to it and you discover that, in fact, you do like it quite a bit. I think the rhythmic incisiveness of this movement, this piece, makes it a thrilling experience as a listener. And watching Yuja move, watching her sort of twitch as the instructions suggest, and hit those offbeats and those accents, which are impossible to anticipate because they don't fall where you metrically expect them to fall. It's a different kind of virtuosity on display here. I see Sheila says, I love this piece. Sheila, I'm with you. It's a tremendous piece. Peter says, form, function, and fashion fully harmonized, even atonally. Well said. If you want, by the way, you can look up Yucha Wong on YouTube and you can find her playing, more conventional repertoire by composers I hinted at the beginning of the program. The Russians, for example, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin. Those composers wrote music which is exceptionally difficult. And if you like sort of romantic schmaltzy music, you can listen to the Tchaikovsky concerto or any of the Rachmaninoff concerti. If you like something that's got a little bit more of a modernist edge, listen to Shostakovich or Prokofiev. Just about any of those composers that I mentioned wrote primarily for the piano, or when they wrote for the piano, it's primarily of a virtuosic nature. Cindy asks, she's amazing. How does she move the music on the iPad? Well, this is something, Cindy, that I've had to learn how to do in the era of COVID, which is to turn my own pages without a page turner. And the way we do it now on tablets is you have a secondary device that you put near your left foot, and you use your left foot to turn the page. And it's connected to the iPad via Bluetooth. And, these things, they're not expensive. They cost $100 or maybe $150 for one that has a few more bells and whistles. And it's a game changer because now you can turn pages and not have to drop notes. And that was historically what musicians reading music had to do, is you have to drop notes. So if I'm playing and I have to turn a page, I have to use my right hand and I keep the left hand going. And I hope that the right hand has a rest, or maybe not too much frenzied activity, so that it's not egregious and noticeable when I have to turn that page. We don't have to do that anymore. Her name is Yuja Wong. First name Yuja, last name Wang. So Yuja Wong. And there's a great interview where she's side by side being interviewed with Gustavo Dudamel, the great Venezuelan conductor who's conducting this ensemble. He's the resident conductor for the LA Philharmonic, which is a top gig. And Dudamel was asked, what's it like playing with Yuja? And he laughs and he says, she doesn't make mistakes. And that's something that we sometimes hear when we talk about Mozart. How many of you have heard that Mozart never made mistakes? And that his manuscripts are free of any revisions. Well, that part's not true. But as a keyboardist, it is true that Mozart, from what we know, just didn't make mistakes. And apparently, according to Gustavo Dudamel, at any rate, the same is true of Yucha Wong. Bessie asks, why are there not as many composer virtuosi today on the order of Mozart or Beethoven? That's a great question, Bessie, and it's a question that invites a broader discussion about the way we perceive music as a society. And this is something I was talking about with my students earlier today, about how the most successful musicians today are often people who have a very limited understanding of music. So let me give you some examples of names that are very popular in the realm of popular music, people who are, on the Billboard top 10, let's say. You would find names historically in the last 10 years like Justin Bieber or Taylor Swift or Katy Perry, or nowadays someone maybe like a Cardi B. Ask me if Cardi B has even a scintilla of music theory knowledge. Does Cardi B know the difference between a C sharp and a seesaw? The answer is no, almost certainly not. Does Cardi B know what the note, how to spell the dominant seventh chord in the key of G major? And the answer is almost certainly absolutely not. The same is probably true of everyone I just mentioned. And yet these people are deco or centimillionaires who are highly successful, and the music often is very basic. So Bessie asks, why are there not as many composer virtuosi today? A great question. I think it has a lot to do with how we as a society, not we on this call, but how society has shifted in the exaltation, not so much of great performers and great technical people who are technically gifted, but rather, as some Roger Kamian put it in the 8th edition of Music and Appreciation, the textbook, is that nowadays we live in a society where the most successful musicians are often people who look like models, who are engineered in a studio to sound great. And that's true. You don't have to, be a brilliant performer anymore because it's just not necessary. So that's my answer, Bessie. Why are there not as many? Because it's just not necessary to be successful. In fact, you can make the argument that people who study and go to conservatory and who play at this level, there's very few opportunities, and I don't think that Yuja Wong is, while I'm sure she does very well for herself, she's not going to make as much money as a Justin Bieber or a Taylor Swift. So the other part of that, by the way, is that there's been this shift that started in the 20th century where students, especially on the college level and the graduate school level, are dissuaded and discouraged from pursuing traditional classical styles, Baroque, Romantic. So if you wanted to make a career as a performer, as a composer especially, you would be encouraged and steered towards modernism and postmodernism and serialism and atonality. So those are just some of the reasons, Bessie. I guess it's just not, fashionable. Society doesn't appreciate it the way it did 200 years ago. We tend to elevate the gestalt, the zeitgeist of today is to elevate people who candidly may not have a scintilla of actual musical skill, and yet they are highly successful because the system, the machine, the various cogs that spin in the realm of music, what passes for musical journalism and in the media, make these people famous. And Cardi B would be a great example of someone who is almost certainly musically clueless. And yet you can fix her voice up with some nice auto tune in the studio and come up with a tune or a loop that, she's not even involved in the creation of. So doesn't someone like Yuja know music so well She must be hearing something all the time. Does she not have the it's just that the music that Yuja Wong is playing is not something that younger people, at least, are going to pursue on their own. Although I want to make a point, and maybe this would be a good epilogue to tonight's program. We could spend many hours talking about virtuosi. We could talk more about Beethoven's virtuoso music, his late piano sonatas, for example, or the Fifth Piano Concerto. We could talk about more about Liszt. We could talk about Chopin. We could talk about Jean Sibelius and his violin concerto. We could talk about Mendelssohn and Tchaikovsky. There's a tremendous treasure trove of works to be explored in this particular vein. But maybe as an epilogue, I'll just say this: someone like a Yuja Wong, because she's young, because she is presenting herself in a certain way that accents her youth and her figure, I guess we would say, clearly there's going to be an appeal to a younger audience. And there have been statistical surveys that have been done and shown that the average age, I think it was with the BSO and the LA Philharmonic, the average age has dropped. The people who are going to the BSO now are generally speaking younger than they were 20 years ago. People who are going to the LA Philharmonic to hear performances of Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn and Brahms, etc., Tchaikovsky, are generally younger than they were 20 years ago. So perhaps there's something to be said for the impact of a virtuoso like Yuja Wong, or a Daniil Trifonov, or an Anna Fedorova, or other musicians like this who have, kind of made a name for themselves, playing very sophisticated, very complex, very intricate, very difficult works, and making it look easy. Although, of course, as we've seen tonight, there's nothing easy about these works that we've discussed. Someone asked, what's the future of classical piano tuners? Mine says that his business is failing. Interesting. Well, that's hard for me to say. I'm not a piano tuner by trade or a piano technician, but I don't know. What's the future of piano tuners? Well, I guess one thing, Maria, that comes to mind is that there's been a proliferation of very sophisticated digital instruments, which completely obviates the need for a tuner. So maybe we'll see more of that. And I don't know, though. Pianos, I think, will always exist. And there's, for many people, a piano is a kind of a nice piece of furniture. It's a beautiful ornament to their house. And even if nobody in the house plays it, they'll keep it around at least for a time because it reflects a certain sense of sophistication. So I don't know. If I don't have any statistics or metrics about the piano tuning business, but that's interesting. Any other questions about what we discussed this evening about Franz Liszt, or Paganini, violin, piano? We focused on piano and violin because those are really the two workhorse instruments in the realm of solo repertoire. And even though we ended with a concerto, of course, the first two pieces we looked at, the Caprices by Paganini and La Campanella by Liszt, are solo pieces. Cindy asked me, what do I think of Schumann? Well, I guess my answer would be, which Schumann? But jokes aside, I love both Schumanns. Robert Schumann wrote some very, very hellishly difficult piano music, and originally wanted to pursue a career as a concert pianist. And then he devised a contraption that was a clamp of sorts that would kind of enhance the independence of his weaker fingers. And it wound up tearing a tendon, and therefore his career was completely derailed by this particular ill-fated decision. Fortunately for Robert Schumann, he was married to one of the greatest pianists in Europe of the 19th century, Clara Schumann, and some works that you could check out if you're wondering, you want to listen to some Schumann piano works. Check out Chrysleriana, check out the David Bundler Tänze, Papillon, Carnival. And for Clara Schumann, I think Clara Schumann's best works are probably her chamber works. So the G minor piano quartet is a brilliant piece. The A minor Romance, which is a solo romanza, is a beautiful piece. These are very difficult pieces. In the 19th century, as we said, the exaltation of the virtuoso meant that composers were going to write in increasing frequency for virtuoso performers. So, great questions. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight's program. Certainly, we were able to explore some unusual repertoire which for many of us was new. And I appreciate you giving this music a chance, because it's always easy, I think, to talk about a Beethoven concerto or Mozart sonata, but to look at a piece by John Adams from 2017 that maybe is written in an atonal style, which people have a natural aversion to. This is how we grow as listeners. It's really important, and I commend everybody for being a part of it. It doesn't mean you have to like it, but just giving it a chance is a very positive development for most listeners. Thank you, everybody, for the very kind comments in chat. Julie, Jeffrey, Maria, Cindy, thank you all.
Gil, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I appreciate everything that you shared with us. It was delightful.
It's my pleasure, man. And maybe as a footnote before we end, we'll just remind everybody that in 2 weeks, on March 23rd, now that's just about 10 days before Good Friday, we're going to be talking about the St. John Passion. So we'll be back here on Zoom talking about Bach's, one of his most towering achievements of his career, the St. John Passion. It's a work that's got many brilliant arias and recitatives and choruses and chorales, but it's also, Amanda, it's a work that's got a lot of polarization and controversy built into it. And that goes back not 300 years to Bach's time, it goes back 2,000 years to the time of the writing of the Gospel according to John. So this is a very, it's a very time-sensitive presentation. We're talking about something in advance of Good Friday, and it's a piece that was written for Good Friday in 1724. So we're really coming up on the 300-year anniversary. And we're really talking about something that's very relevant, I think, even today. It gives us a chance to reflect on 2 millennia of Western civilization and culture, which is going to be a lot of fun. So I look forward to that. That's in 2 weeks.